Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Imagine a land so small on the map that powerful empires thought it could be erased. A land caught between mountains and sea, yet standing firm against centuries of invasion. China ruled it for generations. France tried to reshape its identity. America fought one of its most famous wars on its soil, but Vietnam did not disappear. It resisted, adapted, and survived, again and again. This is not just a story of wars and empires. This is the story of identity, resilience, and a people who refuse to be erased. Today, we journey through more than 4,000 years of Vietnamese history, from ancient kingdoms to the nation that rose from the ashes. Vietnam's identity was not created in a single moment or by a single ruler. It was shaped slowly through centuries of pressure, survival, and adaptation. Formed by people who learned how to endure without losing who they were. From the very beginning, life in the river deltas required cooperation, patience, and resilience, as communities depended on seasonal floods, rice cultivation, and collective labor to survive. These early patterns created a mindset where the group mattered as much as the individual, where family, village, and ancestry became anchors of identity. Even before Vietnam existed as a formal nation, its people were already learning how to live in balance with nature and how to protect their way of life against constant uncertainty. That uncertainty intensified with foreign domination, especially during the long centuries of Chinese rule. For nearly 1,000 years, Vietnam was governed as a province of a larger empire, subjected to foreign laws, language, and administrative systems. Yet instead of disappearing, Vietnamese identity adapted. Confucian ideas were absorbed but reshaped. Chinese writing influenced Vietnamese literature but did not erase the spoken language, and foreign governance existed alongside local customs that continued quietly in villages and homes. This ability to absorb influence without surrendering identity became one of Vietnam's most defining traits. Resistance did not always take the form of open rebellion. It often appeared as cultural persistence, as traditions passed down within families, as stories and rituals preserved away from the centers of power. When resistance did rise openly, it revealed how deeply identity had taken root. Figures like the Trung Sisters were not just military leaders, they were symbols of collective defiance, showing that resistance was not an imported idea, but a natural response born from shared memory and shared struggle. Even when uprisings failed, they reinforced a belief that foreign domination was temporary and unacceptable. Over time, this belief hardened into a national instinct. Independence, once achieved, was not seen as a gift but as a restoration of something that had always belonged to the people. As Vietnam entered its era of independent dynasties, identity continued to evolve through struggle. The constant threat from larger powers meant that survival depended on unity, discipline, and adaptability. Vietnamese leaders learned to rule carefully, balancing centralized authority with local autonomy, knowing that alienating the population could weaken the nation from within. Military victories against forces like the Mongols were not just strategic successes. They became proof that determination and knowledge of the land could overcome even the strongest enemies. These moments entered collective memory and strengthened a shared sense of destiny, reinforcing the idea that Vietnam existed not by accident but through will. Expansion toward the south added another layer to Vietnamese identity. As new lands were incorporated, Vietnam absorbed different cultures, beliefs, and traditions, learning again how to adapt without dissolving. This process was not peaceful, but it showed that Vietnamese identity was flexible enough to grow while still remaining recognizable. Identity became less about fixed borders and more about shared values, loyalty to the land, and continuity across generations. Even internal divisions did not destroy this sense of self, because beneath political conflict, cultural identity remained intact. Colonialism challenged Vietnam in a new way. French rule attempted not only to control territory, but to reshape society, economy, and thought. Traditional systems were disrupted, and exploitation created deep suffering, yet this period also sharpened Vietnamese self-awareness. Exposure to Western ideas of nationalism and revolution gave new language to old instincts of resistance. Identity transformed again, merging ancient cultural pride with modern political consciousness. The struggle was no longer only about protecting traditions, but about reclaiming dignity and self-determination in a global context. The wars of the 20th century tested Vietnamese identity to its limits. Prolonged conflict, massive destruction, and immense loss could have fractured society permanently. Instead, shared hardship reinforced unity. Survival itself became an act of resistance. The willingness of ordinary people to endure unimaginable suffering reflected a deeply ingrained belief that identity was worth preserving at any cost. Even when the nation was divided politically, the sense of being Vietnamese endured across borders, ideologies, and battle lines. After reunification, Vietnam faced a different kind of challenge. Without an external enemy, identity had to adapt once more, shifting from survival in war to survival in peace. Economic hardship, isolation, and uncertainty forced the nation to reconsider how tradition and modernity could coexist. The reforms of the late 20th century were not a rejection of identity, but another adaptation, showing that resilience also meant knowing when to change. Growth and globalization did not erase Vietnamese identity. They tested its strength in new ways, pushing it to evolve without losing its core. Today, Vietnamese identity reflects this long journey. It carries the memory of resistance, the habit of adaptation, and the confidence that comes from survival. It exists in language, family structures, respect for ancestors, and collective pride, but also in ambition, innovation, and openness to the world. The past is not distant in Vietnam, it is present in daily life, shaping attitudes toward authority, community, and resilience. Identity here is not static, it is living, shaped by history but not trapped by it, continuing to evolve as it always has, guided by the same instincts that carried it through centuries of challenge and change for nearly 1,000 years. Vietnam existed under Chinese rule, a period that could have erased a weaker culture entirely, yet instead became one of the most important foundations of Vietnamese identity. Beginning in 111 BC, successive Chinese dynasties governed the region as an extension of their empire, imposing administrative systems, legal codes, and Confucian ideals designed to absorb Vietnam into a broader Chinese world. From the outside, it appeared as if Vietnam was simply becoming another province, but beneath that surface, a quiet and determined cultural survival was taking place, one that would define the nation for centuries to come. Chinese rule brought deep changes to Vietnamese society. Bureaucratic governance replaced local leadership, Chinese became the language of administration and scholarship, and Confucian values reshaped ideas about family, hierarchy, and education. These influences were powerful and long-lasting, but they did not overwrite what already existed. Instead, Vietnamese society selectively absorbed what was useful while preserving its own customs, beliefs, and social structures at the village level. Daily life continued to revolve around rice farming, ancestral worship, and communal traditions that Chinese authorities struggled to fully control. In these villages, Vietnamese language and identity lived on, passed from generation to generation without written records, but reinforced through shared experience and memory. Resistance was not constant rebellion, but it was constant presence. Periodic uprisings erupted whenever Chinese control grew too heavy, reminding rulers that domination was never fully accepted. The most iconic example came in the 1st century when the Trung Sisters led a revolt that briefly restored independence. Their rebellion failed militarily, but its symbolic power was immense. It demonstrated that opposition was rooted not in elite politics, but in collective will, and it created a lasting narrative of resistance that would echo throughout Vietnamese history. These stories were preserved orally, becoming cultural anchors that reinforced identity even when political power was lost. Over time, Vietnamese elites learned to operate within the Chinese system without surrendering their sense of difference. Scholars studied Confucian texts and passed imperial examinations, yet they remained conscious of being Vietnamese rather than Chinese. This dual existence created a unique cultural balance. Chinese models of governance were adopted, but they were applied through a distinctly Vietnamese lens, shaped by local conditions and values. The result was not cultural submission, but cultural adaptation, a survival strategy that allowed Vietnam to endure without open confrontation, when confrontation would have meant annihilation. Language played a critical role in this survival. While classical Chinese dominated official writing, the spoken Vietnamese language remained untouched in everyday life. Over time, Vietnamese scholars developed their own writing system, using modified Chinese characters to record the Vietnamese language. This effort reflected a deep desire to preserve linguistic identity even under foreign rule. Language became both a tool of survival and a quiet form of resistance, ensuring that Vietnamese thought, expression, and world remained distinct despite centuries of political control. Religion and belief systems further reveal how Vietnamese culture endured. Buddhism, which entered Vietnam through China, blended with local spiritual practices rather than replacing them. Ancestor worship remained central to Vietnamese life, reinforcing family bonds and continuity across generations. These practices created a sense of permanence that foreign rule could not disrupt. Even as dynasties changed and administrators rotated, cultural rituals rooted people to their past and affirmed their collective identity. The long experience of Chinese rule also shaped Vietnam's political instincts. Vietnamese leaders who later governed independent dynasties understood both the strengths and weaknesses of Chinese imperial systems because they had lived under them. This knowledge allowed Vietnam to resist future attempts at domination more effectively. Independence, when it finally came in the 10th century, was not the creation of something new, but the reassertion of something that had survived invisibly for centuries. The end of Chinese rule revealed that Vietnam had never truly disappeared as a distinct civilization. The psychological impact of this survival cannot be overstated. Enduring nearly a millennium of foreign control without losing identity created a deep confidence in cultural resilience. It taught the Vietnamese people that domination could be temporary, but identity could be permanent. This belief became a core part of national consciousness, influencing how Vietnam responded to later threats from the Mongols, the French, and even modern superpowers. Each new challenge was understood through the memory of having survived before. At the same time, Chinese rule left lasting influences that Vietnam did not reject after independence. Confucian ethics, administrative structures, and educational ideals remained part of Vietnamese society, demonstrating that survival did not require rejection of all foreign influence. Instead, Vietnam emerged as a culture that could integrate external ideas while maintaining a clear sense of self. This balance became one of the country's greatest strengths, allowing it to evolve without dissolving. The survival of Vietnamese culture during Chinese rule also reinforced the importance of unity at the local level. Villages became the guardians of identity, preserving language, customs, and collective memory. This decentralization of culture made it harder to erase, because identity did not depend on courts or capitals, but lived in ordinary people. Even when political power was lost, cultural continuity remained intact. When Vietnam finally reclaimed independence, it did so with a deeply rooted sense of who it was and who it was not. The centuries of survival had refined Vietnamese identity, sharpening its boundaries while allowing flexibility within them. The experience of Chinese rule became not a story of cultural defeat, but one of endurance and quiet strength. It proved that a people could be ruled, taxed, and governed by outsiders, yet still remain themselves, carrying their identity forward through time. Intact, resilient, and unbroken Vietnam's survival as a nation was never guaranteed, and much of its continuity can be traced to the rise of strong dynasties and legendary leaders who understood that independence required constant effort, unity, and strategic intelligence. After centuries of foreign domination, early Vietnamese rulers did not simply celebrate freedom, they focused on securing it. They recognized that Vietnam's geography, sitting beside powerful neighbors and along important trade routes, meant that threats would never fully disappear. As a result, leadership in Vietnam became closely tied to the ability to defend the land, organize society, and maintain a shared sense of purpose among the people. The early dynasties worked carefully to strengthen the state from within. Rulers invested in agriculture, irrigation, and land distribution, knowing that a stable food supply was essential for both social order and military readiness. Rice farming was not just an economic activity, it was a foundation of national survival, binding communities together and creating a population capable of sustaining long-term resistance if necessary. These dynasties also emphasized education and administration, adopting systems that allowed the state to function efficiently while remaining rooted in local realities. Leadership was not distant or abstract, it was connected to everyday life, reinforcing loyalty and shared identity. Vietnamese leaders quickly learned that brute force alone would not protect the nation. Instead, they relied on adaptability and deep knowledge of their environment. Dense forests, winding rivers, and rugged terrain became natural allies. Military strategy focused on mobility, surprise, and patience rather than direct confrontation. This approach reached its peak during moments when Vietnam faced overwhelming odds, especially during invasions by larger empires. Victory was not achieved by matching strength with strength, but by wearing down the enemy and turning geography into a weapon. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century became one of the defining tests of Vietnamese leadership. At a time when the Mongol Empire seemed unstoppable, Vietnamese commanders understood that survival depended on unity between rulers and people. Villages were evacuated, supplies were denied to invaders, and battles were chosen carefully. Leaders like Tran Hung Dao became legends not only for their tactical brilliance, but for their ability to inspire collective sacrifice. These victories were more than military successes. They reinforced the belief that Vietnam could stand against any power if it remained united and disciplined. Leadership also played a critical role in Vietnam's gradual expansion southward. This process was not a sudden conquest, but a slow movement of settlement, integration, and adaptation. Vietnamese rulers encouraged migration into new lands while maintaining a sense of cultural continuity. As borders shifted, leadership focused on incorporating new populations and managing diversity rather than enforcing rigid uniformity. This approach allowed Vietnam to grow geographically without losing its core identity. Expansion became a strategy for survival, securing resources and space while reducing vulnerability to northern threats. Strong dynasties also understood the importance of legitimacy. rulers presented themselves not merely as kings, but as guardians of the land and protectors of the people. Mandate and moral authority mattered deeply, especially in a society shaped by Confucian values. When leaders failed to govern justly or protect the population, rebellions followed, reinforcing the idea that leadership existed to serve national survival rather than personal power. This dynamic created a political culture where strength was measured not only by control, but by responsibility. Even during periods of internal division, the legacy of strong leadership endured. Rival factions might compete for power, but they shared a common understanding of external danger and cultural continuity. This shared awareness prevented fragmentation from becoming total collapse. The memory of past victories and heroic leaders served as a reminder of what was possible, encouraging future generations to rise when the nation was threatened again. These traditions of leadership carried forward into later centuries, shaping resistance against colonial powers. The image of the leader as a symbol of national will remain powerful. Revolutionary figures drew inspiration from ancient generals and kings, presenting their struggle as part of a long historical continuum rather than a new ideological conflict. This connection to the past gave legitimacy to modern movements and helped mobilize the population on a massive scale. The strength of Vietnamese leadership was never about domination alone, it was about endurance. Leaders understood that survival required flexibility, that adaptation was not weakness, and that identity could be preserved even while systems evolved. They balanced tradition with innovation, borrowing ideas when useful and rejecting them when dangerous. This balance allowed Vietnam to navigate centuries of pressure without losing coherence as a nation. Over time, legendary leaders became more than historical figures, they became cultural symbols. Their stories were taught, remembered, and retold, reinforcing values of loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience. These narratives shaped how ordinary people understood their place in history, connecting individual lives to a larger national story. Leadership, in this sense, extended beyond rulers and generals. It became a shared mindset carried by the people themselves. Through strong dynasties and decisive leaders, Vietnam learned how to defend its independence, manage expansion, and survive in a hostile world. This legacy did not disappear with the end of monarchies. It continued to influence how the nation responded to modern challenges. The pattern remained the same: unity in the face of danger, adaptability in strategy, and an unshakable belief that survival was possible through collective strength and determination. Colonialism and Cold War conflict marked one of the most painful and transformative periods in Vietnam's history, bringing immense suffering while simultaneously forging a powerful sense of modern nationalism that would redefine the nation's future. When French colonial rule tightened its grip in the 19th century, Vietnam faced a form of domination that was different from earlier foreign influence. This was not a system that sought to rule from afar while allowing local life to continue quietly. It was a system designed to extract, control, and reshape society in the image of a distant empire. Traditional structures were disrupted, land was taken for plantations, and heavy taxes pushed countless peasants into poverty, creating deep resentment that would simmer for generations. Yet colonial rule also exposed Vietnam to new ideas that transformed resistance into organized nationalism. Western education introduced concepts of nationhood, citizenship, and political rights, even as colonial policies denied those very ideals to the Vietnamese people. This contradiction sharpened awareness of injustice and gave language to long-standing instincts of resistance. Intellectuals and students began to imagine Vietnam not just as a cultural community, but as a modern nation entitled to sovereignty. colonialism unintentionally helped create the tools that would eventually challenge it. The early 20th century saw the rise of political movements that blended traditional patriotism with revolutionary ideology. Leaders emerged who understood that independence required mass participation, not just elite rebellion. Among them, Ho Chi Minh became the most influential, drawing inspiration from both Vietnamese history and global anti-colonial movements. His vision framed independence as part of a worldwide struggle against imperialism, connecting Vietnam's local experience to a broader human cause. This reframing gave Vietnamese nationalism a moral weight that resonated deeply among ordinary people. World War II intensified these dynamics. Japanese occupation weakened French authority and exposed the fragility of colonial control. Famine swept through the countryside, killing millions and revealing the devastating consequences of foreign domination. Suffering became a unifying experience, strengthening collective resolve. When independence was declared in 1945, it was not simply a political announcement, it was the emotional release of decades of frustration, sacrifice, and hope. The struggle did not end there. France's attempt to reclaim Vietnam plunged the country into prolonged war, forcing nationalism to be tested under extreme conditions. Villages became battlefields, families were displaced, and entire generations grew up in conflict. Yet the shared experience of resistance deepened national consciousness. Independence was no longer an abstract idea, it became a daily struggle woven into survival itself. Victory against France reinforced the belief that unity and sacrifice could overcome even the strongest powers. The Cold War transformed Vietnam's struggle into a global confrontation. The division of the country reflected ideological battles far beyond its borders, but for Vietnamese people, the conflict remained deeply personal. The war against the United States brought unprecedented destruction, testing the limits of endurance. Bombings devastated cities and countryside alike, while civilian suffering became a defining feature of the conflict. Yet even in this devastation, nationalism intensified rather than collapsed. The war was framed not just as a fight for ideology, but as a continuation of Vietnam's long resistance against foreign intervention. This period reshaped Vietnamese nationalism into something deeply modern. It was no longer only about preserving culture or expelling occupiers. It was about defining Vietnam's place in the world. National identity became tied to sacrifice, resilience, and collective responsibility. The willingness of ordinary people to endure hardship for a shared goal reinforced the idea that the nation existed not merely as territory, but as a community bound by shared struggle. At the same time, the cost was immense. Millions of lives were lost, infrastructure was destroyed, and psychological scars ran deep. Families were divided, trust was strained, and the aftermath of war left the nation exhausted. Yet these wounds did not erase nationalism, they reshaped it. Survival itself became a source of pride, and rebuilding became an act of national affirmation. The memory of suffering strengthened resolve to never again be dominated by foreign powers. After reunification, Vietnam faced isolation and economic hardship, testing whether nationalism could survive without an external enemy. The challenge shifted from resistance to reconstruction. National pride had to adapt to new realities, balancing ideological commitment with practical needs. The decision to reform the economy in later decades reflected a pragmatic nationalism, one that prioritized survival and dignity over rigid dogma. The legacy of colonialism and Cold War conflict continues to shape Vietnam's identity today. Modern nationalism is not rooted solely in victory, but in endurance. It carries the memory of suffering as a warning and a lesson, reminding the nation of the cost of division and the value of unity. This nationalism is cautious yet confident, shaped by history but not trapped by it. Through colonial exploitation and global conflict, Vietnam's national consciousness was sharpened rather than destroyed. The experience transformed resistance into a unifying force that connected past struggles with modern aspirations. It forged a sense of identity grounded in sacrifice, resilience, and determination, an identity that continues to influence how Vietnam sees itself and navigates the world, shaped by history, strengthened by hardship, and sustained by an unbroken belief in independence and self-determination. Vietnam's transformation from a war-torn nation into a rising modern economy is one of the most remarkable examples of resilience in recent history, rooted in the country's ability to learn from hardship without abandoning its core identity. When the wars ended and the nation was reunified, peace did not immediately bring stability or prosperity. Instead, Vietnam faced economic collapse, international isolation, and widespread poverty. Cities lay damaged, infrastructure was weak, and millions struggled simply to survive. The challenge was no longer how to resist foreign powers, but how to rebuild a nation that had been exhausted by decades of conflict. In the years following reunification, Vietnam relied on a centralized economic system that prioritized equality and state control, but the reality proved harsh. Food shortages became common, productivity remained low, and daily life was filled with uncertainty. Many families depended on informal markets and community support to get by. Yet even during these difficult years, resilience remained visible in everyday survival. People adapted, shared resources, and found ways to endure, drawing on the same collective mindset that had sustained them through war. By the mid-1980s, it became clear that survival required change. The leadership faced a critical decision: either maintain rigid systems and risk deeper crisis, or reform while preserving political stability. The introduction of economic reforms marked a turning point, allowing market mechanisms to function within a socialist framework. Farmers were given greater control over land, private businesses were gradually legalized, and foreign investment was encouraged. These changes did not happen overnight, but they unleashed energy that had long been suppressed. The impact of reform was profound. Agricultural productivity increased rapidly, turning Vietnam from a food importing country into one of the world's leading rice exporters. Small businesses flourished, markets became vibrant, and urban centers began to grow. For the first time in decades, optimism returned. This growth was not driven by sudden wealth, but by millions of small improvements that accumulated over time, reflecting a deep cultural emphasis on hard work and persistence. Integration into the global economy further accelerated Vietnam's transformation. Diplomatic normalization, trade agreements, and regional cooperation opened new opportunities. Factories expanded, exports increased, and global supply chains began to include Vietnam as a key partner. Education and skills development became national priorities, especially for a young population eager to move forward. The country's ability to balance openness with sovereignty reflected lessons learned from history, engaging with the world without surrendering control. Modernization also brought challenges. Rapid urbanization strained infrastructure, income inequality emerged, and traditional ways of life faced pressure. Yet even these challenges were approached with pragmatism rather than fear. Vietnamese society showed a willingness to debate, adjust, and adapt, understanding that progress required flexibility. Cultural traditions remained strong, coexisting with modern ambitions rather than being replaced by them. What makes Vietnam's rise particularly significant is that it did not require forgetting the past. War memorials, historical sites, and collective memory remain central to national consciousness. These reminders serve not to dwell on suffering, but to reinforce gratitude for stability and peace. The past functions as a guide, shaping attitudes toward independence, unity, and long-term thinking. Today, Vietnam stands as a confident nation with a growing economy, expanding middle class, and increasing global influence. Its cities are filled with innovation and energy, while rural areas continue to evolve. The same resilience that once sustained survival under bombardment now fuels entrepreneurship and development. Progress is understood not as a break from history, but as its continuation in a new form. Vietnam's modern success is inseparable from its past struggles. The ability to reform without collapse, to open without losing identity, and to grow without forgetting sacrifice reflects a deeply ingrained resilience. It shows that strength is not only measured in resistance, but in renewal. From devastation emerged determination, from poverty came adaptability, and from isolation grew engagement with the world. The story of Vietnam's rise reminds us that nations shaped by hardship often possess a unique capacity to rebuild. Their progress is not accidental, it is earned through experience, discipline, and collective effort. Vietnam's journey from war-torn survival to modern growth stands as proof that resilience, when combined with thoughtful reform, can turn even the deepest scars into foundations for a stronger future.